Welcome to the evening session of the Saturday conference. I'm Rich Sidwell. I'm a member of the board of the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions. Glad to have everyone with us on this day of presentations. I'm sure that you've all enjoyed the conference so far. There's a lots more to come. I'm pleased to be able to introduce the last speaker of the afternoon. Sallie owns and manages Paicines Ranch, a 7,600 acre ranch in Central California. She's an impact investor, an activist, a philanthropic funder in regenerative agriculture. She's also the founder of No Regrets Initiative, which seeks to use a wide forms of capital, human, natural, investment, and philanthropic, to affect change in the agricultural system. This presentation follows a format that we've been using throughout. At the end of her PowerPoint presentation, there'll be a time for questions and answers. You can post your questions in the chat, and we'll take them as they come through on the chat session. So I'm happy to turn it over to you, Sallie. We're really glad to have you. Thank you for joining us.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Rich. And thanks to Susan and the conference organizers for inviting me. And I'm thrilled to be with you in Ohio without being in Ohio. This works well. So I also haven't been doing a lot of speaking over the last 6 months or so it could be a little rusty. And it's odd to speak on Zoom where I can't see what you guys think. But anyway, I'm just going to go for it. And hopefully there'll be questions and we can have a conversation at the end. So I'm really here to talk about joy, hope, beauty, possibility, optimism, and my favorite part is magic. And yes, I do know it's 2020. I have been alive for the last 8 months. And while it has challenged my optimism, it remains. And in fact, what we've lived through this year just makes me ready to double down on the idea of how do we make our world more resilient in the face of the challenges that we face. So how come I'm still optimistic at this point? I mean, I live in California. Talk about a year of doom and gloom. My birthday was September the 9th. We were 6 weeks into the worst fire season ever, 6 weeks of bad air. And that day was the day we call the apocalyptic day now, in retrospect. It's the day the sun didn't come out. The whole world was orange and red. And what we learned that day is that that's how people think the world is going to end. That is the human perception of what the world will look like when it ends. So it's been a rough year, but I maintain my absolute conviction that we have no idea what's possible if we can effectively combine solar energy, photosynthesis, the brilliance of the biome, and the creativity of humanity in partnership. I think we can't really imagine the possibilities, but we know we can take the first steps toward finding out, and that's really what I am all about. And all we just need will, along with large doses of humility, curiosity, intent, and transformed relationships. And we can change or discard the boxes that we live in. You know, we've created all these systems, but when they don't serve us, we can change them. They're not laws of nature. And I think that's actually the exciting thing about 2020 and living through the pandemic, is that things we never imagined to be possible became instantly possible. Really, it's just stuff we never thought could happen. And so while that's been terrible in a lot of ways, it's also amazing to think about in terms of opportunity. You know, we as humans imagine that things will continue along the way they are. But of course, that's not really the way change often happens. It's often disruptive and unexpected and unanticipated. And we're in this moment. And I think that the challenge and the excitement is to not just survive this, but to lean into it and create the world that we want to see. And the thing about it, there's a lot of talk about pandemic as portal and the things we should leave behind. And I hope there's lots of things we leave behind as we go forward. But we do know that when we come out the other side of the portal, whenever that is, that climate change is still going to be on the other side. That's not a thing, that is a law of nature. That is not a thing we can leave behind on this side. So that's kind of how I've been looking at the current situation. And I'm a practitioner of holistic management. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And the most important premise of holistic management, I think, is this idea of managing for what you want. As humans, we generally manage to get rid of the thing we don't want, right? We have the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on poverty. And as soon as we start those wars, we basically institutionalize the thing we're fighting, and we focus on the thing we're fighting, not the thing we want. So rather than the war on poverty, how about if we'd had the initiative for thriving communities, right? So just this flip. And so I think the question now is, what do we want to create together? And I've sort of started from the place of, I want to, create a world where all living beings can thrive with a stable atmosphere and a climate where habitats are healthy and diverse, mass extinction doesn't threaten us, water in our streams and rivers is clean, our soils are healthy, all the things I think that probably virtually all of us attending this conference want, right? And I think it's important that we keep in mind that. That's the vision. I'm not trying to get rid of some form of agriculture or get rid of the use of pesticides. I'm trying to create this world. And that's what all of my work has been about. And I can't lay out a roadmap for this, because I'm pretty sure that if we work our way out of this, we have no idea how it could happen. There's no plausible, practical plan I can give you that says if we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we'll end up there. So I'm pretty convinced that it's going to look like magic until it looks like it was inevitable. And I don't know. I'm anxious to see how it all turns out. So I'm going to now share just a little bit about what I've been doing for the last 20 years to try and change agriculture, which I think is a key to this moving from the world we have to this world I just said that we want to create. It's kind of the causal nexus of a lot of problems and is a key to changing the way things work. So I will dive into that. My current work really started 20 years ago when I became sort of an accidental rancher. I suddenly went from being an organic gardener with a few raised beds on a couple of acres to the steward of 7,600 acres in Central California. And let me show you a little bit. I'm going to start a slideshow here, hopefully successfully. And there we go. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my place and what happens there. And I was explaining to Rich and Susan the other week. So this is the Paicines Ranch. This is the view from my husband's favorite spot that we call Gin Mountain. And many gin and tonics have been drunk here at sunset. And so this is actually the Paicines Ranch in the middle of summer. We're a place where it rains about 10 inches a year if we're lucky. We're about 30 miles inland from Monterey Bay and 2 hours south of San Francisco. And this year, our last measurable rainfall was on April the 6th. And it rained Thursday night. We got 0.05 inches on Thursday night, which means the fire season should end next week, hopefully. So that's big news. But so this is the ranch in the summer, which is odd to look at if you're from back east. And this probably hadn't rained for 5 months when this picture was taken. And this is probably the ranch in March. So what happens is it's about to rain next week. When that happens, the grass will germinate and poof, it will turn neon green. It's like God took a bucket of neon paint and a big paintbrush and just went nuts on the hills. So this is our rangeland, and this is what about 7,000 acres of the ranch looks like. The most beautiful place on earth, in my humble, totally biased opinion. We have a pretty large flock of sheep. By the end of next week, we should have about 1,300 ewes. We have thousands of sheep on the ranch. This is some sheep in some of our irrigated crop ground. This is a center pivot. We're one of the strange people in Central California that has a central pivot, which you guys are probably all familiar with, but have become very rare in California. And we have historic buildings that go back to the 1860s. And so we have a very cool headquarters area. So that's kind of what I walked into completely unexpectedly. And I grew up in Tennessee, so adapting to this climate took me a really long time, but I think I'm now pretty much a Californian. So once I became a rancher, I realized I didn't know anything. It's a really good position to be in. So it became about following the crumbs, and I would have lunch with anyone. I would go to any conference. I would learn anything. And that was true when I got into philanthropy and impact investing too. I assumed I didn't know anything. And like my peers in my holistic management training class always said that was my unfair advantage. was that I didn't have to unlearn anything. And I got to ask all the stupid questions without even knowing that they were stupid questions. So I've tried to maintain that attitude. I've become a bit more opinionated on things than I started out being 20 years ago, as you'll see by the end of this talk. But basically, I was introduced to holistic management really early on. A few months after we bought the ranch, I met the woman who had sold our ranch to developers a decade before. And she told me I should go home and read a book, because if she'd read that book, she'd still own the ranch, not me. And I thought, well, that's a good teaser. So I went home and ordered Alan Savory's book on holistic management, and I read it. And I didn't understand much of it. You could argue I still don't. But the thing that I got was a little worm went into my brain and said that maybe by changing the way we manage domesticated livestock on California's rangelands, we could bring back these California native grasses, which are pretty much gone. And I'd been gardening with them for 20 years in my backyard. And for some reason, I really wanted that to happen. So that's a little worm. It got in, and it's basically now eaten my brain, as you'll see during this presentation. But it all started with, could we just bring back these little perennial bunch grasses? And good news, that is happening on the ranch. But of course, now that's just the first step. Now we have lots more to do. But I joined the Holistic Management International Board in the early 2000s as a way to learn. And in 2008, I was introduced to the idea that maybe you can sequester carbon in grasslands, that maybe you can actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the soil. And I remember I spent that whole weekend thinking only about that and whether that was true. Could this work? Like, this could be a really, really big deal. And no one's talking about this. And I had all those questions that people still have today. The biggest ones are things like, is it enough carbon to make a difference? Can it happen fast enough? Will it really matter? And since then, I've spent a lot of time learning about this. And I mean, we know now that the carbon in the soil today, even as degraded as it is, it's still the largest carbon sink on the planet behind the ocean. It's got twice as much carbon in it as the atmosphere does even now. And when we've taken a lot of carbon out of the soil and put it in the atmosphere, we're still in that position. And it's got 3 times as much as the 4 trillion trees and all the other plants that grow in the world. So yes, it is big enough to make a difference. And yes, we can put it back. And we're learning a lot about how the carbon could go back in the soil. And I'm gonna hopefully, really quick, stay with me here. This is a little geeky. You all learned about photosynthesis at some point in middle school. But what they didn't tell you is it's the most important process on the whole planet. All terrestrial life hinges on this. So very quickly, the way this works is, as we know, the leaves photosynthesize, but what that is the plants absorb the CO2 and they get the solar energy and water from the soil. This process creates oxygen, which goes back up into the air, and it creates complex sugars, which are used to grow the plant, pretty obvious, but wait, there's more. It turns out that somewhere between 20 and 70% of all the energy created by photosynthesis actually leaks out of the roots. And for a long time, botanists thought, why would a plant do that? It's kind of crazy to spend all that energy. It turns out that's what feeds the microbial community in the soil. And the reason the plant does that is entirely selfish. It's like an economy. It basically trades sugars for the nutrients that it needs. But these exudates grow things like humus and glomalin and the microbes in the soil, and that's carbon. All those things are made of carbon. And so that's basically how we can suck CO2 out of the soil, out of the air, and put it in the soil. And if you have water, this can happen amazingly quickly. You guys have water, I don't. So where I can irrigate, it can happen quickly. But places like Will Harris in Georgia, he is building organic matter and in fact topsoil. So the thing is, not only can you increase the soil organic matter in the existing topsoil, you can grow topsoil. There's this idea from the old chemistry view of soil that it's just weathering rocks and it takes forever. That's not true. Almost all the soil on the planet was actually made through biology. So this is really a revolution around soil understanding that is about biology far more than chemistry. And based on what we've learned, and in fact, based on the work of people like Albert Howard and Lady Balfour and indigenous communities for thousands of years, all those people, all we've learned collectively, we've kind of reduced this into the 5 key principles of soil health. Quickly, you keep the soil covered. You minimize disturbance. Where disturbance is interesting because it's not just tilling, but it's also pesticides, herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers. You want plant diversity. You want continual live plant roots. And if you can, you want to put animals back into cropping systems. So pretty straightforward principles. But if you think about it, if we set out to design a system of agriculture that did the opposite of this, we'd kind of have what we have today. We would have large scale annual monocultures, and they're disastrous for soil health. So what are we going to do? Plus, the other thing is that if we do manage to put more soil organic, more soil carbon, we will have lots of amazing co-benefits that come from that. Things like more water infiltration, the kind of things you heard about from Judith and that many people are working on in terms of watersheds. We should have more production with many fewer toxic inputs, fewer greenhouse gases, and it's becoming pretty clear that we'll have more nutritious food if we have this healthy microbial community and we can actually get all the nutrients into the plants that we need as humans. So, I mean, you hear all this arguing about how quickly it can happen. Doesn't really matter how quickly it can happen. We just need to start. And in fact, I'll get to this. Yeah, we just need to start. And there are millions of people around the world who are working on this. I mean, we need billions of people. There are billions of land stewards. And imagine my sort of, pipe dream for the world is that every square foot of the world is managed to sequester carbon, to grow food, and to create beauty and biodiversity. I mean, so think about it. It's your backyard, it's your raised bed, it's the road median in your community, it's the local park, it's the national forest. What if we just managed everywhere? And these things come together. You can't really get more soil organic matter unless you have more diversity. You can't poison the soil and have this work. So they all come together, but what would the world look like? We don't have any clue, but I would love to find out with your help. So enough on soil. So 20 years ago, I became a rancher. About 15 years ago, I became an impact investor. 10 years ago, really got into ag and food philanthropy and actually started convening. I hosted the first workshop at the Paicines Ranch 10 and a half years ago because I wanted to learn from the world's experts in holistic management. So I started bringing them to the ranch and kind of worked at it in these silos for years. And I really hated the money part. All I wanted to do was hang out with farmers and ranchers. That's the fun part. And this money part was super irritating. But I met all these people at places like RSF Social Finance, and I met people who kept beating on me because we'd ended up with large financial resources from working in Silicon Valley for 25 years. And they kept beating on me that I couldn't ignore what my money was doing. And but it took me years. But finally, I had this sort of epiphany after hanging out with these people for years that if actually the money went into the food and agriculture system, both philanthropic and investing, that it wasn't separate, that I could do all of these things at the same time and still hang out with farmers and ranchers. And I was just bringing another resource to the system. I was just introducing another kind of energy into the change that I wanted to make. So that happened about 5 years ago, and we decided to try to look at it all together. And we called it the No Regrets Initiative. So it's the work on the ranch, Paicines Ranch. The Paicines Ranch Learning Center is our convening and workshop entity. Cienega Capital is our investment company, and I'll say more about that later. And the Globetrotter Foundation is kind of the home of the philanthropy. And it's called the No Regrets Initiative. Stick with me here, but soil carbon sequestration has been called a no regrets negative emissions technology. So a negative emissions technology is something that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it somewhere where it can't exacerbate climate change. So like scrubbing, those things are going to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and put them in a cavern or something. That would qualify as a negative emissions technology, and soil does too. And it's been called a no regrets negative emissions technology because of the state of agricultural soils around the world. At least 50% of them are degraded to some degree at this point. And the United Nations estimates we have about 57 harvests left if we continue to treat our topsoil the way we treat it. So it's arguable that even if there were no climate change, the most important work of the 21st century would be getting back to having healthy agricultural soils, because we still have to eat even if there were no climate change. So every moment we spend on increasing the carbon in the soil and the soil organic matter has many benefits that go far beyond climate change. And the other reason it's called the No Regrets Initiative is that when my grandkids, who I don't have yet, but hopefully will, look at me and say, Grandma, weren't you alive when all this happened? What the heck? What did you do? So I will be able to say that whether it worked or not, I did everything that I could think of. And because I believe there's some urgency around this, it was a 10-year program. We have 6 years to go, 10-year initiative, 6 years to go. At the end, I'll be 70, and there will have been 2 more global climate meetings of the big, giant global climate meetings. And one of our measures of success, not that we will have had much to do with it, is that soil health and land stewardship and natural solutions will be super important in that second meeting. And then I can quit and go hang out on the ranch and do nothing at that point. So we also decided that we would do a philanthropic spin down because frankly, if you care about climate change and you have philanthropic funding, I don't know why you would ever think about keeping it in the bank at this point. It's now or never. So that's how I've been thinking about it. And all these stupid entities are really just created by the tax code. The idea is to mobilize capital to change a system. And the change we're trying to make is to regenerate the agricultural soils of North America and the communities who steward them. So it's not just about the soil, but all the communities who have basically had the wealth extracted from them. And it's about creating real wealth on the ground and having that wealth accrue to the people who actually accomplish that. So, of course, as you can hear, we're about to run into the financial system. But anyway, we'll get to that. This is the No Regrets team. We have a lot of fun because frankly, if it's not fun and joyful, who wants to do it? So, and besides, it may all be for nothing. So we got to have a good time while we try to pull this off. So what's happening on the ground at the ranch? So I'll talk a little bit about each of the activities on the ground, in our investing, and then in our philanthropy. Quickly, I'll zip through. Let's see what time we got. Okay, so this is our new vineyard, which is designed to be managed all year round by sheep to never be tilled. The sheep manage the vineyard floor, but they also do all the suckering and they do all the end pruning. So the idea is normally sheep have to come out of a vineyard as soon as the buds break because sheep love grape leaves. And if you know about vineyards, you can see that this vineyard is trellised much higher than a normal vineyard, which puts the leaves and the fruit above the height of the sheep. So, you know, there's a terrible labor problem in California. And if we can actually have the sheep do much of the work, that's pretty exciting. So this vineyard's 4 years old. If you manage to come visit us in Paicines in 3 years, we should have wine. So I invite you all to come visit us. This is grazing on our rangeland. And actually the top picture is pretty high density grazing on the future vineyard site. So that's now planted in vines. And we spent about 3 years trying to get the soil to be in good shape before we planted the vineyard, so we never have to till again. Down below, you can see we have mob grazing of sheep. So we do holistic planned grazing, which I think you guys have heard about during this conference. And basically it's an animal is in a given place for a given amount of time for a reason. We're using them to manage animal performance and the ecosystem and all kinds of other things. And then you also consider the quality of life of the managers, which is an important consideration. These are some pictures from our educational workshops and convenings that we do. Obviously, not a lot going on in 2020. Unfortunately, we love to provide immersive experiential learning for people, and we will again someday. And then we do a lot of weddings and we do agritourism. And in fact, this year we had doubled down on agritourism. Great plan. We were supposed to have 20 weddings this year. We had 1.5. So anyway, like most farmers and ranchers, we are stacking enterprises to figure out how to have this become financially viable. And our crop ground, we're raising cattle, lambs, turkeys, chickens, and pigs. And diversity, we really manage for diversity in everything. And that has to be in our product mix as well. And on the ranch, we're making lots of progress. We're trying to, we're trying to figure out how to regenerate the system. Our cropland has been farmed for probably over 100 years. It's been used with part of chemical farming in the 20th century. And in this century, it was leased for 15 years to a large industrial scale organic producer, which was really destroying our soil health. So we're trying to come up with another model ourselves. So we know how hard organic minimum till farming is. And I'd say that in the regenerative agriculture world, this whole idea of collaboration and biology and resilience and working together, different scales, diversity is going pretty well. I think we have a community in regenerative agriculture. Yes, we work very hard to empower women to have more of a leadership in that space. And obviously now we need to center BIPOC voices. We need to bring everyone to the table of regenerative agriculture, but I am optimistic about that. I think agriculture is going to change. When we get to the investment piece though, well, this is much harder. This is not a community of sharing and collaboration and diversity and different scales. So I was right not to think this was going to be as much fun, but it's work that needs doing. And we work with producers and their direct customers. We don't get very far up the food chain. We don't invest in juice or bars, where all the money is. So all types of capital. We've done equity, lending, revenue sharing, really any kind of plan that we hope works for the innovator that we want to support here. And we've made loans for just about anything you could think of in agriculture: sheep, cattle, irrigation pipe, freezer repairs, land, inventory, wells, cars, trucks. If you need it to grow food, we've probably made a loan on it. And what's just a little discouraging is that we're sort of doing the work of the banker on Main Street who isn't doing this work anymore, because we're lending to producers who aren't insured by the federal government. And those producers right now all over the country are having a terrible time getting capital. And so this is our tiny little effort to address this for innovators and also to try and get other people to think about this. And these are just some logos of some of the amazing companies that we gotten to work with. And we do work all over the country. We don't take a regional or local approach to our investing, because frankly, what's happening in the United States is all the wealth has been sucked from the middle of the country to the coasts. And we do not need another coffee shop in Oakland. What we need is to change agriculture, and we need to put capital where the capital is needed to do that. So that's the way we look at that. And in our investment criteria, these are the things that we look at. Things like, is it beautiful? Does it make the land healthier? Does it enable people and animals to stay on the land and hopefully increase? And you'll see there is no financial goal here. We want the entities we invest in to become financially viable in the long term, but we don't say we have to make a minimum return. And the second point is the important one. We only invest in deals structured to avoid exit pressure. So for example, we don't invest with venture capitalists generally, because that's where exit pressure comes from. So we are patient capital, sometimes under market, sometimes not. It really just depends. And on the philanthropic side, this is, again, logos of a lot of the amazing organizations that we've had a chance to work with. And they are mostly organizations that are supporting farmers and ranchers pretty directly, providing technical assistance or trying to build the whole Center of Regenerative Agriculture. Some is around research and some is around land access. But it's basically, we kind of think of this as we're hoping to finance an ecosystem, right? We take an ecosystem approach to everything. And on the top, I think it's 2019. These are all the grants we made, and that the height indicates size, and then the color indicates sort of which of those buckets it went into. And this is kind of the way program officers look at things. In fact, when Avery put it up the first time, I was like, ugh, you're starting to think like a program officer. But then on the bottom, you see a prairie, a healthy diverse prairie. So the way we think about this now is if you flip this over, it sort of mirrors the roots of a prairie, because we need a whole wide diversity of plants, but a healthy prairie has hundreds of plants in it, right? And of different sizes, some are low, some are tall, roots go different places. So we kind of decided to look at our grant making that way, not a few big grants, not all the same kind of grant, not the same kind of organizations. So we try to think about ecosystems in everything that we do. Some pictures from our convenings, which are really working with producers, investors, and philanthropists. And it's about seeing differently and connecting with each other. We call it ruining lives. Our goal is that once you come to one of our 48 or 72-hour experiences, you will never see the world the same, and you will have joined a new community. And a lot of them do center around women taking leadership roles, but the learning journey is for investors and philanthropists. Lead with Land is for land stewards with means. So across the spectrum, we're trying to get people on the ranch, learning and connecting with each other. And that's kind of the No Regret initiative that we've been working on for the last 5 years. So these are some of our favorite pictures, but I'm gonna turn off the screen sharing now and kind of close. I'm gonna start with the 3 questions I get all the time, so you don't have to ask these in the chat box. The first one is, how do you measure your impact? This is usually the first question. We tried for like 2 years to come up with some great quantitative way to measure impact, and we gave up. So when I hear that question, I see faces and I hear voices and I see farms and I think of stories. And I think of this whole ecosystem and how the people, the work the people we support are doing and how they're connected to each other. And so I can't reduce this to numbers. So we think about beauty, complexity, connection, community, those criteria that we had, and we don't measure the impact at all in sort of a conventional way. The other question we get is, how can this possibly scale, right? I mean, a lot of these enterprises we invest in are small. We don't mind if a company stays small. If we think about it, nature is unimaginably huge and complex because it fills every niche with abundance and diversity. So we look for appropriate scale, and we totally reject the idea that every idea or tactic or organization has to scale, has to get bigger. It has to be appropriate for its place, its mission, and the people involved in it. We like scaling across. We hate scaling up. And in fact, if you come to us and pitch an idea that you tell us is replicable across the whole United States, that's not a very good pitch with us, because we're like, yeah, but how good is it in your place, right? So that's our answer on scale. And then people want to talk about return. And it's different from impact, right? In the financial world, we talk about return. In the philanthropic world, we talk about impact. We think of them all together. It's a change we're trying to make. It doesn't matter which world we live in. But people usually mean financial return. In fact, virtually always they mean financial return. They ask that question. And there's lots of kinds of return, not just financial. We have no financial return goal, as I said. And if you think about it, over the last 50 years, 60 years, financial return has skyrocketed. And arguably, social and ecological returns have gone negative pretty dramatically. And we think it's time to ask the question of, is it realistic to expect to get market rate financial returns while we dig ourselves out of this hole that we've dug with market rate financial returns? And we believe that it is possible that there are times when financial return actually needs to go negative to create positive social and ecological return. That's kind of what philanthropy is. And people get that. They get the 100% loss in philanthropy. But there's this idea that once you call it an investment, once the IRS thinks it's an investment, or even if you're a foundation, that you have to make money. And so we just try to challenge that whole idea. And besides, people are always saying, when is regenerative agriculture going to make money? It drives me nuts. This year, gross revenue to farms in the United States, 40% of that gross revenue is coming from the federal government. So, and I believe that, I can't remember there's an economist, I can't remember the guy's name, Ken somebody, and he's shown that whatever size organizational entity you take in the United States, there is a net negative return on agriculture before subsidies. So the reality is, most of agriculture today is making money because of the crop insurance and the subsidy payments. And regenerative agriculture doesn't get those things. So we'll make money as soon as the right kinds of activities are supported, and probably not before, really. Though there are a lot of regenerative agriculture farmers who are making money with their own unique farms that they've created. So I shouldn't play that down, but on the whole, this idea of when will you make money because your food is so expensive and is really kind of the wrong question. It's really, the elephant in the room is about agriculture in general, production agriculture making money on its own. So that's kind of where I think we are. Another thing we're thinking about, so now soil health and land-based solutions are becoming a big deal. I've always said there was going to come a moment when the world looked around and went, oh my gosh, we actually have to do this. Like, climate change is here. We should do something. So I didn't think it would take us this long to get here, but I was talking to Al Gore a couple weeks ago, my first chance ever to talk to him, and he said that it has happened, that the moment is here, that the recent announcements from China and Japan, Korea, and the EU indicate that we are there. So now we're like, it's like the election. We'll celebrate for one day. Woo, we're here. But now there are these big questions that come about. So if we're here, probably what's going to happen, and you can already see it, is money wants to come into this space and make this transition happen fast. So the question we're asking as the field explodes is, how do we create good outcomes for land stewards and their communities as we go through this change? I don't want to see this happen and have Bayer and DuPont and Syngenta and the carbon markets on Wall Street be where the money goes and the organizations that profit. You know, we often liken water to money, and water, you got to have it. You can't grow without it, but if you have too much of it, it's really destructive. And so our big concern now is, how do we make this transition in a way that works for land stewards and their communities? And then we have this internal question around what's our work to do. 10 years ago, if you came to me for a grant and said, we care about soil health, I wrote you a check. It's not quite so straightforward anymore. And there's tons of players in the field. So we just internally are just asking the question of what's our thing to do. So it's an interesting time to talk about joy and hope and possibility. And but I'm excited about it. I am frustrated that we keep coming around to money. We keep talking about money in the face of the crisis, that we can't afford. I don't know how you say that we can't afford to do these things, given what's at stake. It doesn't make any sense to me. And how on earth anybody talks about perpetuity right now, perpetuity of foundations and this. I don't know, if there's no humans, perpetuity as a concept kind of goes away. So I realized, I was able to come into this work with a crazy amount of privilege, and it's built on, the flawed system of the United States of America. I come from the South. I could talk about that at length, but I just feel compelled to do something. And I'm really kind of here to try and inspire everybody else to figure out what kind of world you want. What resources do you have? There's your time, your energy, your whatever you've got, and to show up and try to create the world that you want. So my strategy, for the next 6 years at least, is to really go all in, to play hard. We play a lot of pinball and ping pong at the Paicines Ranch, to learn, to share, to support each other, to create the conditions for magic, and then to be open to it when it arrives. And I hope, if it works, it's going to be a really wild ride, and I want to be on it with all of you. So that's it. I'm happy to have a conversation and take questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Sallie. Very impressive presentation. You covered a lot of territory in a short period of time. We do have a lot of your sense of optimism rings throughout all of this. It's very impressive, and it's one of the things, one of the characteristics that we all need in the midst of our work, is to carry that sense of empowerment and productivity and collaborative work that really sees our way through to a better place. We have a number of questions rolling in, and I'll start with the first one. I don't know whether you can see them or not, but the first one is your work in any way connected with the Regen network, REGEN network, founded by Christian Shearer?
We're not officially connected, but we are connected. Yes, we're aware of each other. I haven't had an opportunity to work together yet.
Okay. Another question. In the age of COVID, today I heard that COVID is now the third leading cause of death in the United States. How is food and farming connected to how we move forward? Are you investing in COVID challenges and solutions?
So the second part first, we did in the spring when the pandemic started, we did decide to increase our philanthropic funding this year by 50%.
Wow.
Most of that we granted in the spring in immediate COVID response. And our plan at that point was we were going to do COVID response there. Much of it went to indigenous communities, stressed agricultural communities around the country for immediate response. And our idea was to move to infrastructure in the fall. I think none of us thought this was going to last so long. So we're still working on what our fall response is, but we think that what's come out of this is that more of an understanding about resilient food systems and how regional food systems are probably more resilient in the face of chaos. I think the pandemic is a bit of a warm up in this case for climate change. So we're trying to support efforts that can lead to systemic change there. And in terms of about the third leading cause of death. So I think that America is not a very healthy country, right? We have all these terrible chronic underlying conditions. I like to say that we have the world's healthiest food system if you think 48 hours out from when you ate the food, and the most dangerous ever invented if you want to live for another 20 years. So I do think we're not having enough of a conversation about the impact of the food that we're eating on the health of our communities, which is impacting what's happening relative to COVID. So, and we do work on this whole idea of connecting soil health with nutritious food. And we've hosted a couple of convenings with the medical professionals, Daphne Miller of pharmacology, called Health from the Soil Up, to try and get this connection to be much more prominent than it is. So.
Thank you. Another comment question. This all sounds wonderful. Could you talk about the kinds of research that your philanthropy supports? In other words, and you've just talked about that. Maybe you want to elaborate a little more. Futures anticipated.
Yeah, so that's kind of that's one field of research. The place where we're most interested is the work of organizations like Ecdysis, Jonathan Lundgren in South Dakota, who's one of the few academics doing research around from a systems perspective. So I would argue that current agricultural research and even the Western research paradigm doesn't work very good in a complex system. If we reduce a cornfield to its tiny reducible parts, we don't really learn very much. So like Jonathan, for example, he and one of his students published the first peer-reviewed paper on what actually has happened in a regeneratively managed cornfield. So rather than designing an experiment and going 3 years and figuring out what happens and then publishing something that's meaningless to farmers and ranchers, we try to support research that actually works for farmers and ranchers, like the Organic Farming Research Foundation. And yeah, so stuff that's meaningful and not so reductionist and taken out of the systems context.
Okay, I'll keep moving here. Next question is, person says, I'm so interested in your comment about the way we do agriculture is the basis of what's wrong in our world. So the question is, do you think that this is somehow related to the social unrest and injustice going on in our country right now?
I actually do. I think we always come back to, as a team, we always come back to this idea of disconnection and then exploitation. And agriculture in this country has been based on exploitation of people and planet from the beginning in order to accrue wealth for others. And I think it's just a core premise, and agriculture it's throughout our society, but agriculture was the first and it's probably still one of the most obvious. So I think that as long as we believe that it is okay to exploit the people and the planet, we are going to have the issues that we have today. And and we have to fix that to fix agriculture from my perspective. So yeah, we have to give that up as a foundational belief in the United States of America.
Good. Why 6 years?
So it started out as 10 years. We're 4 years in. It started out as 10 years because I was only willing to commit to work hard until I was 70. And then I get to rethink.
Oh, okay. All right. There's a gentleman who's had his hand raised, and Bill Callahan has raised his hand. I don't see a question from him. Well, there are more questions here. And I don't know whether Bill, I'm wondering if you could unmute and ask your question or make a comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I did not have a question. I accidentally must have hit the raise hand button. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Thank you. I'll go back to the questions that are posted here on the chat. Here's one's. This is after the 6 years question. I'm wondering how your team has advocated for zero return on environmental investments. This is a wonderful concept in my opinion, but I can imagine you get a lot of pushback. And so I'm curious to know how you make that argument, either people who don't get it, how you make that argument to people who don't get it.
Well, it's hard. I work with a brilliant woman named Esther Park, who is really good at articulating this argument. If you're interested, you might find some of her presentations on YouTube, and we've done some conversations about it. And it's hard. And the specific thing that we do, other than speaking about it all the time, we're just trying to get people to think about it. And then we bring investors to the ranch and we hand them a shovel and we hand them a magnifying glass and a thermometer, and we send them out into the field with other people and just try to get them to see. And I don't know if it makes any difference or not. You know, we won't know. And we get a lot of pushback. But I also think that in the 12 years I've been hanging out in these financial circles, there are a lot more people who get it. And I do think that the paradigm is changing. It's a little, I don't know if it's good or bad. The Goldman Sachs is now heavily into impact investing. I think it's probably bad, but it's a much more of a conversation than it was. So I'm optimistic that we might be able to change the basic premise, but that is the hardest thing, the most discouraging.
So I'm going to follow question on the chat. I'm going to follow briefly by saying and asking, are there good ways that you've learned to show that in fact it's a very positive return on the investment? It just isn't increasing the value of their money.
Well, that's what we try and do. And I think actually what was interesting is that the pandemic sort of did that. Yeah. I think early on in the pandemic, when you suddenly couldn't get meat in the grocery store, I think that was a very concrete example of there's more than your financial return at stake here. So that's kind of the first concrete example. We haven't come up with one that's that good.
The pandemic has provided quite an opportunity in a lot of ways, for sure. Mm-hmm. Another question here. Are you partnering with Indigenous philanthropy, Seventh Generation Fund, for example?
Our biggest partner in that space has been the First Nations Development Institute, and it's pretty new for us. I think we made our first significant grant in the spring, but we're moving more in that direction. And yes.
Good. I'm seeing several comments. I don't see more questions at the moment. One of the ones that comes to me is how do you attract investors to all the work that you're doing? How do you pool investments? How do you get the word out that this is the work that investors should be doing?
Again, we bring investors together. We host people bringing like Lift Economy. We work with them. So at the moment, we're sort of just talking. We have not made an investment fund. So Cienega Capital is not open to other investors. We do often work with co-investors. And so we have a community of people that we work with that we're always trying to grow, and we invest together. We usually also, if we're going to invest somewhere like Kentucky, where we've made a couple of interesting investments, we work hard to get a local or regional co-investor who's familiar with that region and can maybe be the lead. So it's really about being the Pied Piper and just trying people to follow along. I wish I had a better answer, but money is so funny. You know, it's like, I remember I was part of a cohort. We've been meeting together for 3 or 4 years, very progressive people when it came to financial stuff. And then we did a case study, and it's a real live company, and here's the stuff, and, you know, talk about it, and do you want to invest? And these people, it was like a switch flipped, and they put on this little finance hat, And suddenly the questions were completely different. They were like all Scroogey and so it's I don't know.
I have a question. In terms of carbon markets or ecosystem service markets, do you think that there are feasible ways for farmers to get paid for their work in regeneration?
I think maybe in ecosystem services markets, particularly water, it seems like there's some real, depending on the watershed that you're in and the issues that it has. I mean, I think there should be, like here, we're looking at trying to really change the way almonds get grown, which could make such a huge difference in the Central Valley if we could stop draining the aquifers and if we could have good drinking water. So I think so in ecosystem services markets. I'm really have been skeptical about carbon markets, though there is a new project coming out of Michigan State and Skidmore that's modeled on the forestry carbon markets that were done. That is the first proposal I've seen that actually would compensate farmers who have already started down the journey with enough money to actually matter upfront and then incremental payments. Because traditionally what they're asking us is to make really long-term commitments for tiny amounts of money if it's all about additionality. So I'm still skeptical about carbon markets. This idea of doing the same thing they did in forestry might have some potential, and we're looking at funding the effort that would be required to launch that. So
is that something that you could share a link about or a little bit? Because I know we have investors on the call who are interested in carbon.
Yeah, right now it's a philanthropic effort, but I could send that to you. Yeah, I don't know that they even have a website yet.
Right. Thank you, Sallie.
Another question on the chat line. If I'm interested in visiting and learning from your farm, how would I do that?
Well, that's a great question. If you go to the No Regrets Initiative webpage, you can sign up for our mailing lists. And one way would be to come for one of our classes or learning journeys, which are hopefully starting again in the fall of 2021. Depending on what your role is in the food system, there would be workshops. And if you want to just come and visit, you can book on Airbnb and send me an email and let me know you're coming, and we'll give you a tour.
It's a beautiful place. I was able to visit there a couple of years ago. I'm also receiving texts from our conference committee that I'd like to read you a couple of. One is, she's an exciting presenter. Can we adopt her?
Depends.
It appears to me, Sallie, that you're doing a lot with a pretty small staff. I take it that those are your at least somewhat paid staff. Are they all full-time people? And do you and do you also have a cohort of volunteers that I'm looking at that ranch, and I know enough about farming operations to know that it takes a lot of time to manage rotational grazing and the number of animals and the type of animals. Looks to me like you're doing a lot with a small staff. It's very impressive.
Well, I probably should have clarified. So that's the picture that I showed is the No Regrets Initiative team, all of whom are full-time, only one of whom actually works full-time on the ranch.
Oh, okay.
Staff of about 14 or 15 people at the ranch. I mean,
Okay.
like somebody runs weddings. Oof, I'm not going anywhere near that. I did deliver meat today, but no, so we do have a much larger staff. And the other way I kind of cheat, to be perfectly honest, is I've been running software companies since 1980. So we also have a back office staff that handles all of the entities. So it's a bigger team. That's the dedicated No Regrets team, but there is a bigger team doing all the work. Good question.
And do you are you trying to make the ranch financially profitable at the same time as you are rebuilding the soil and demonstrating really good regenerative practices?
So we're trying. We're not a livelihood ranch. That's definitely true. And what we really are trying to do, like on the vineyard, we have this mantra of we only do things on the farming and ranching side that a rational farmer or rancher would do.
Okay,
So the idea is to document the financial performance of the vineyard as a standalone enterprise, and that needs to be financially viable. So that's kind of how the whole thing, I can do all kinds of crazy things, and I don't want to justify them with
right, right.
trying to necessarily, but we don't do 22 weddings for fun or to regenerate the soil. We do 22 weddings a year because of the financial impact of that. And also it's a chance to tell the story.
Sure.
But so sort of is the answer.
Okay. I don't see other questions coming from chat. It's, as I say, that your whole presentation is very impressive. As someone who has lived almost all my life in Ohio and had lived with about 40 inches of annual rainfall, it's very hard to understand how you can ranch with on 10 inches a year.
I don't know what idiot decided to buy a ranch with only 10 inches of rain a year.
Obviously, you're doing it, and you're irrigating. You talked about pumping the aquifer, Central Valley aquifer. Are you irrigating from wells between during the dry season?
So for 500 acres, we do have 500 irrigated acres. That it does come from an aquifer. We monitor the aquifers carefully. I mean, and now the state of California is starting to monitor the aquifers carefully. The way I look at this is this has been irrigated for a long time. The aquifer has held, doesn't mean it will hold in the future, but I'm okay using the water now because we need to repair the soil, which will happen a lot faster if we can apply water. It would be irresponsible to continue to degrade the soil using water. But
Yeah.
I'm okay if we can improve the soil using water and getting to the point where if we can no longer pump from the aquifer, we will be able to grow a lot more food if we've managed to get that soil productive and biologically active. So yes, so we irrigate 500 acres. The rest is just if the rain falls, the grass grows, and if not, it doesn't.
Do you mind if I ask another question, Rich?
Go ahead.
So Sallie, we met at a Business Alliance for Local Living Economy event a few years ago, which is when I came to Paicines. But are there, for people who are interested in the intersection of investing and, the new economy and the new food economy, are there organizations or resources in terms of websites or books or speakers? I mean, Michael Schumann has been to our village a couple times, but who do you think is doing some of the more interesting work in this intersection?
So I think RSF Social Finance has long written about it. They have a really interesting program now called their Integrated Capital Institute. And if anybody's interested in actually working in the field, that would be something to check out. They're just putting together amazing cohorts of people who want to help move finance in this direction. So they're doing very cool things. There's a conference to check out, kind of in reaction to SOCAP, which is kind of a mainstream impact investing conference, a little painful to attend sometimes. It's called COCAP, and it's conscious capitalism. And that happened last year for the first time. So those are the two, and I mean, right, slow money for sure, but those are the two that kind of new efforts that come to mind. But there are a lot. There are a lot of people starting to talk about this.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've reached the end of a very, very productive and useful hour. Thank you very much for taking time to share with us at this conference. And as you know, it's all recorded, so some of the people who can't attend every session are still going to be able to get the benefit of your presentation. And you can as well, of course. These 3 days are jam-packed. So we're going to take a break for an hour break for dinner. Conference attenders are invited to come back here at 6:30 Eastern time for the evening program. It'll be a performance by the World House Choir. People who attended last year's conference will remember their amazing performance. It'll also be the presentation of the Arthur Morgan Award and the keynote address from Rowan White, who I understand is actually going to be able to appear this evening. She's, pardon our dog. Appear this evening. She's missed out on the conference so far because of fires in California. But the last word I heard with it, we will be able to have presentations this evening. So we'll look forward to that. So thank you very much. And we'll take a break for an hour.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
There.